So I'm also here with my colleague Anna today, and we'll be presenting together. So just a little background on Collaborate. We support the culture, thinking and practice of collaboration. A lot of our work is actually focused on supporting place-based change at a local level, but also looking at the patterns across those areas, thinking actually what does this mean at a national level. And the Human Learning Systems work we've been doing with Toby and colleagues over the past few years is one example of that. So today we wanted to pick up on the theme of learning, which has come out in Elena's presentation and a lot yesterday as well. So what we wanted to cover today was kind of what we see a collaborative society looking like, how we're seeing the response to COVID, kind of starting to put some of that into action, and then really focus on the importance of rapid and purposeful learning in helping us to kind of shape the future, to shape the new normal. We're also going to introduce a framework, a learning framework, that may be helpful for some of you to try and capture that learning now, so we can really intentionally create the future that we want to see. And I think in our kind of focus on some of the local examples, I think it might throw up some really interesting questions about kind of some of the contrasts between that kind of command and control response Elena talked about at the national level, and how, while it's a bit of a generalisation, how perhaps locally we are seeing more collaborative approaches, how we are perhaps seeing more distributed power, particularly when it comes to that more human community response. So to start with, I'm going to hand over to Anna, who's going to talk you through the first bit of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Dawn. Morning, everybody. Dawn, are you going to control the slides?
Yes, I will do.
Okay, great. So I'm going to move on. We just wanted to start by trying to put this into context a little bit in terms of some of the thinking that we've been doing as an organisation over the past 12 or 18 months. We published something called the Manifesto for a Collaborative Society in January this year. And it's really interesting looking back at some of the observations that we were making of practice that we're seeing across the country at a local level and in all sorts of different sectors and in all sorts of different contexts. And the rapid adaptations that we're seeing in public services and local collaboration in response to COVID-19 now. We set out this very simple framework which covers these kind of different domains around collaborative leadership, collaborative organisations and organising, collaborative communities, collaborative public services and the collaborative economy. And I think that we're seeing strong elements of all of these dimensions, I think, coming forward in the response to COVID-19, particularly around collaborative organisations, collaborative communities and collaborative public services, well, and collaborative leadership. And I'm probably less familiar with what's going on the economy side, although the response of some of our companies in terms of the way that they've repurposed their manufacturing and all of that sort of stuff is probably very relevant as well. So I'm just going to move on by offering a few reflections about some of the changes that we're seeing, which we think reflect some of those changes that we were beginning to identify across the country before COVID-19 happened. We thought it would be useful just to share this reflection from a local authority who shared with us some internal memos that they had been circulating among people within the local authority, but also all of their local partners. And it was really interesting memo where the person who'd been responsible for leading the crisis response in this London borough was saying, you know, sort of listing the amazing achievements that they'd realised in terms of, you know, number of food parcels, number of volunteers, you know, number of this, that and the other, these kind of, you know, metrics around success, but also was able, even at quite an early stage, to step back and say, the culture change that we've achieved through focusing together on the things that really matter in this kind of crisis response is huge. And it's so interesting. We're interviewing local authorities at the moment about what's been going on, and the story again and again around the kind of acceleration of culture change, changes in practice, changes in thinking, the acceleration in the building of relationships that we're seeing across local systems as everyone you know, rapidly responds with one kind of objective in mind, which is about, in the main, protecting the most vulnerable people in the community, is really fascinating. So very, very relevant to the human learning systems practice around the breaking down of silos, the rapid building of relationships and trust, much more mature kind of approach to risk management, people just kind of getting on with it. operating with, kindness and empathy. We've seen the word love used in a few instances. And I think that one of the things that is so fascinating and will become really important as we kind of move beyond the kind of crisis into sort of stabilization and then longer term response will be how can we kind of maintain some of these adaptations that we're seeing now, because they are accelerated versions of the small changes that we were identifying in that manifesto and that we've identified together in the Human Learning Systems work over the past few years. And the other thing that's interesting is that we haven't seen this response obviously just within public services, but across organisations and sectors who are part of the crisis response. I don't think I've ever had so many conversations with people in local authorities where they've been talking about how important their relationship with the voluntary sector and the third sector and the community is right now. So we also just sharing on this slide some highlights from a blog from the Children's Society, which captures some of the learning insights that they're generating from their work around, unprecedented levels of collaboration internally and externally. The pioneering of new tools and approaches to support young people, and that again, that sort of idea that people are just stepping up and doing what's required without worrying too much about the consequences. We'll worry about that later. Do you want to just move on, Dawn? Thank you. So Dawn's going to talk in a moment about the tool that we've developed to try and help organisations and systems to do this learning work. But the point is that we believe that with so much adaptation taking place so rapidly, of such significance, that it's extremely important that organisations and systems invest their time and energy in doing some learning activity now to capture those insights, which they may come back to later to reflect on. And we've developed this kind of model here, an adaptation of a model originally proposed by the Brogan Institute around these kinds of the way that change happens. And I think what we're seeing is an acceleration of the decline of a kind of previous paradigm, business as usual, and the emergence, the rapid emergence, accelerated emergence of a future state. And I suppose I say future state rather than current state, because again, it's kind of emergent and fragile. And the work that we believe that organisations and systems need to be doing now is around dedicated effort for learning in this crisis response environment in order to build forwards and transition towards a future state that is much more collaborative, human-centred, and founded on kind of learning activity, as we've described in the Human Learning Systems work. Dawn, you're going to explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so at this point we just wanted to share a few really brief insights, really focusing on kind of where we are now in this diagram. So the crisis response, how are we learning from fast adaptations? And then we'll have a little bit of a think about how we can continue to use learning to help shape that emerging future state. So a few weeks ago, we just threw out a few questions on Twitter over a week just to start to capture some of the initial responses to the crisis. We didn't ask questions specifically around human learning systems, but so many of the themes that came back were so relevant. So we were just going to share a few of those snapshots now. Obviously, it is a tiny snapshot, it's not representative, but there were some key themes coming up. So I think in terms of human, like the words empathy, love, relationships, connections, trust, came up again and again. And I think for me, what's been really interesting is the focus on trust. And among whether it's local authorities, whether it's charitable funders, whether it's charities and community groups, really devolving decision making much closer to the ground, recognising that people working in communities directly in connection with the issues, they're the people who are best placed to make the decisions that we need in such a complex context. When it comes to learning, we're seeing people reflecting on the value of prototyping, the value of experimentation. The quote at the bottom about kind of shifting from focusing on KPIs to thinking more about actually what are the changes we care about in people's lives. But also I think one of the key things that came out here is the fact that what we're learning it's kind of common sense. We knew this all along. And I think when we're talking about human learning systems, it is so much common sense, but the fact that actually this is an opportunity to put into practice what we know is needed, and also try to make that common sense the reality for the long term. And then finally, in terms of systems, lots of brilliant examples from across different sectors about kind of working together in the interests of communities, getting beyond organisational boundaries. And yeah, there were loads of brilliant examples in the first webinar yesterday about how we're seeing this happen in communities. And I suppose it's quite interesting to reflect on kind of what areas are kind of doing this already, and they've just built on that. And actually, what are those areas that didn't really have a tradition of collaboration, and what are their journeys? I'm quite conscious that often we are talking to a small bubble of people who really get and are interested in this practice. So yeah, we're really keen to think about how far is this practice the norm or not. So as I said, these are some just really quick insights on the initial crisis response, but we're really interested in how do we not stop learning? How do we really start to consciously capture some of the positive changes that are happening and think really purposefully about how we embed these in for the long term. So Gary from Plymouth yesterday was talking about we can't go back. We need to make the decision to make this change for the long term. So to help places and people do that, we've developed some really simple tools which encourages people to reflect both on their own practice but also across their organisation and across their system. I think one of the really interesting angles is to explore, how are individuals' experiences reflective of the wider system? What are the commonalities? What are the differences? These are just some simple questions that might be helpful in prompting your reflections. And then we've also created these questions which dig a bit deeper. So obviously there are some really brilliant practical examples of services going online, food parcels being delivered, and there's some real practical things that are really important. But we wanted to pose these questions to really capture that kind of cultural change that Anna was talking about. So it's the cultural change which is going to take us into that new normal. So really consciously thinking about what new relationships are we seeing, what new behaviours are we seeing, how are we reimagining what we think is important. And I think Andy's going to touch a bit more there on the regulation side. So yeah, really we just wanted to share this tool. I think primarily we intended it as a local tool, but we do think there's a really important role for kind of looking across local experiences, seeing the patterns and thinking about what does this mean across the country, and also what does that mean for the kind of enabling environment we need nationally, and how is that different to what came before. Yeah, that's it from us.